Today, we're going to be continuing our journey through the book of 1 Corinthians. So if you have your Bibles, I'll invite you to go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is where we'll be looking at today. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in the seat back in front of you. If you don't own a Bible, then feel free to take that one with you when you go as our gift to you. If you're going to use that Bible, we're on page 898 is where 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is. We're in a section of 1 Corinthians where Paul is addressing all of the different ways that the culture had negatively influenced the church at Corinth. Specifically, we've been dealing with romantic relationships and the difference between how the culture viewed those versus how Christians are supposed to view those through the lens of the gospel. You see, the world views romantic relationships very differently than believers are supposed to. Paul, if you remember, Paul ended chapter 6 with a strong command that the Corinthians were to flee sexual immorality. Now, Paul did not command them to flee sex. Rather, he told them to flee unauthorized sex. And you'll remember that sex is a gift from God, and anything God gives, God governs. Anything God gives, God governs. And so, since God gave man the gift of sex, God then governs an authorized and unauthorized ways of having sex. Well, apparently, the Corinthians had a lot of questions about what constituted biblical marriage. They were really curious about it, and so Paul sits down and he writes to them based on several different scenarios what God's will is, what God wants a person to do. That's why all of chapter 7 is dealing with the various scenarios of human relationships. You may remember scenario number 1 was the celibate. Paul said that it was good, it was fine, it was allowable for a person to remain celibate if that individual decided to live that way. That was fine, as long as they weren't going to give in to sexual temptation. You remember scenario number 2 was the divorced and the widowed. Paul said, as they received this letter from Paul, no doubt some of them were divorced and some of them were widowed. And you remember Paul's term for divorced is the word unmarried. The unmarried are not widowers. The unmarried are not celibate. The unmarried are not virgins or the betrothed. That left really only one category, that the unmarried meant the divorced. To both of those groups, the divorced and the widowed, Paul said that it was good for them to remain single as long as they weren't going to give in to sexual temptation. Hopefully you're seeing a trend. Scenario 3 was a Christian who finds themselves married to another Christian. And Paul said God's rule for a Christian marriage is that divorce is never on the table under any circumstance except for adultery. Jesus gave the one exception for divorce among Christians, and that was adultery. But every other issue, every other scenario, when a man who is a Christian is married to a woman who is a Christian, God says, not Tim, God says divorce is never an option except for adultery. Scenario 4 was a Christian who finds themselves married to an unbeliever who wants to stay married. Some of the Corinthians were married to individuals who were non-believers. So their question was, should I divorce my unbelieving spouse in order to find a Christian spouse? And Paul's answer was, absolutely not. A believer should not divorce their unbelieving spouse except for adultery. And scenario 5 was a Christian who finds themselves married to an unbeliever who wants a divorce. They want out. Some of the Corinthians found themselves married to unbelievers who wanted out. Their spouse didn't take too kindly to their change in religion, and so they wanted out of the marriage. What was God's rule? Let them go. Don't fight the divorce. Don't turn your home into a spiritual war zone. Paul literally says, let them depart. And that person would be free to remarry. Now last week, that was 2 weeks ago, last week, Paul interrupts these scenarios to give us the big principle for living the Christian life. And here's the big principle. He kind of zooms out, you remember? He interrupts himself to teach us this principle, and here it is. Every believer should live in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to him. So if the Lord has assigned, if the Lord has saved you, if the Lord has given you the life that you have, whether it is married, whether it is single, whether it is slave, whether it is free, whether it is male, whether it is female, none of that mattered. Paul said every believer ought to live the life that God has assigned to them. Now, Paul's going to close out chapter 7 today by addressing one more scenario. Who's left? He's dealt with the celibate, he's dealt with the married, he's dealt with Christians, he's dealt with Christians and non-Christians, he's dealt with divorced. Who could be left? Well, look at verse 25. He says, now concerning the betrothed. If you're reading out the King James, it'll say the virgins. These are what we in our culture call the singles. The singles. You know, our culture, if we're just being honest, throws a lot of shade toward people who are single. Oftentimes, people who are single are treated as though there is something wrong with them, and that's why they're single. In fact, many singles can be the victim of baseless whispers. What's wrong with him? I heard she has this problem. I heard he's got a bad temper. Well, in this final scenario of the end of chapter 7, Paul is actually going to give us 6 reasons for remaining single. 6 reasons that singleness might be preferred for a believer. Understand this. The Bible treats singleness and marriage both as good, right, okay options. Throughout chapter 7, Paul has said over and over and over again, singleness might be preferred if you can restrain yourself from sexual immorality. Now in this last section, Paul doubles down and he's going to give us 6 reasons why singleness might be preferred over marriage. If you're already married, I'm sorry. All right? If you're already married, I'm sorry. You can't get out of it now that you find out singleness might have been a better option. Of course, 1 year of marriage might have already taught you that singleness might be a better option. Here we go. Reason number 1 that singleness might be preferred. Number 1 is because of the present distress. Singleness might be preferred because of the present distress. Look what he says in verse 25. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Now let's pause there. Paul says, I have no command from the Lord. Paul is saying Jesus didn't teach on singleness. Jesus didn't give us a command. I have no command from the Lord. But that does not mean that Paul is just giving us his opinion. What Paul is saying is, I don't have a text from Jesus to tell you what I'm getting ready to tell you, but the Holy Spirit is telling me to tell you this. So what Paul is saying is, I don't have a commandment from Jesus. I am giving you new revelation. I'm giving you new teaching from God. Paul says, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment. Now again, Paul is not saying this is Paul's opinion. When a person has authority, his judgments have authority. Let me give you an example. If you go to court and the judge says, here's my judgment, you're guilty and you have earned 90 days. What would happen if you looked at the judge and said, well, good for you, that's your opinion, why do I care what you think? What would happen? Where would you end up? In jail, probably for more than 90 days at this point. Why? You said that's just his opinion. Yes, but he has authority. And when his authority, it follows with his judgment. It follows with his opinion. So when a judge says, my opinion, my judgment is this, it carries the authority of the position. Do you understand? Paul is saying, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, I am giving you my judgment. I am giving you my opinion. And it's not just the opinion of a mere man. No, it carries the authority of Jesus Christ himself. Why? Because as an apostle, Paul says, I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. It's trustworthy. Now we have to pay attention because Paul's not giving us a command, he's giving us instruction, right? He says that I have no command from the Lord, but I'm giving my instruction, my judgment, my opinion. Paul is not going to tell us in this passage what every Christian single must do. He did that with the Christians marrying Christians, right? Paul says when a Christian marries a Christian, they are not to divorce for any reason. Here he's saying, if you're a Christian and you're single, you have an option. I'm going to tell you what I think the best option is, Paul says, but he's not giving a commandment. So what should the singles of Corinth do? What should they probably do? Look at verse 26. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Present distress, that phrase in the Greek means calamity. It means stress. 10 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, Roman persecution of Christians reached a fever pitch under Emperor Nero. Nero's persecution against Christians was calculated, and it was sadistic. Nero would take Christians and he would sew wild animal skins on them and then turn them loose into an arena where wild dogs would think that they were attacking an animal, but there was actually a human inside of that skin and would literally watch as they tore them apart. Nero would take Christians and he would dip clothing in wax, and he would put that waxed-filled clothing on the Christians, and he would attach them to a pole and then light those wax clothes on fire. That's literally how Nero lit his gardens at night, was with the bodies of Christians burning as torches. He was evil and he was sadistic, and all of this happened just 10 years after Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians. In fact, the greatest source we have of Christian persecution is a book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. And in Fox's Book of Martyrs, it actually records the martyrdom of a man named Erastus, who was the city treasurer of Corinth. Apparently, while Paul writes this letter, Paul sensed the tension from the Roman government and the present stress and the present calamity of the world. And he said, listen to me, that's a good reason to stay single. Singleness might be better for you due to the present calamity, the present distress of the world. Look what he says in verse 27. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Calamity, persecution is not a reason for divorce. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Why should political pressure affect whether a Christian marries or not? Ladies, can you imagine being the wife of Paul? The man that you follow, the man that you love, and watch him month after month and year after year be beat and imprisoned and whipped and scourged and stoned. Can you imagine the anguish as a wife knowing that when your husband said, "My bags are packed and I'm headed to Ephesus," that probably might be the last time you ever saw him again? Men, can you imagine going to the next town, knowing that you would be in prison, knowing you would be abused, knowing the pain and the anxiety that you would bring your wife, knowing what was going to happen? Can you imagine the weight and the gravity of that? And so when the church is being pressed and when the church is being squeezed, Paul said, you might want to consider singleness because of the present distress of the world. Paul gives a second reason. Singleness might be preferred. You ready? Because marriage is hard. Because marriage is hard. Look what he says in verse 28. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. But yet, those who marry will have worldly troubles. And I would spare you that. Paul says, if a single person decides to marry, it's not a sin. They have an option. If a betrothed woman marries, she doesn't sin. She has an option. That's how we know. Again, Paul's not giving a command that every single must be married or every single must stay single. He's giving instruction. And he says, it's better if you stay single, but if you marry, you don't sin. Yet, he is going to give them the second thing to think about. Those who marry will have worldly troubles. Not pressure like persecution, but worldly troubles. Here's what Paul's simply pointing out. Marriage might fix your temptation for sexual immorality, but marriage causes a lot of other problems. Do you know there's a lot of problems that married people have that single people don't? Paul calls it troubles. Literally, it means to press together or to put pressure. Has your marriage ever had pressure because there was two of you? Yes. Don't act like you all are a perfect couple. You've had pressure. Why? Because there's two of you. In marriage, there are two personalities. In marriage, there are two distinct persons with likes and dislikes. There are two different emotions. There are two different temperaments. There are two different wills in marriage. Don't believe me? Go home, get in the car, and say, where do you want to eat? Trouble. I've said it this way before. Marriage is psychological. She's psycho and I'm logical. But marriage creates constant pressure situations where a couple has to find a solution that a single doesn't. I can't tell you how many couples have sat in my office, star-eyed, staring at each other, telling me their plans for getting married, and they just couldn't fathom what I said about marriage being hard. They just couldn't imagine it. They can't believe that the butterflies will wear off. They can't believe that the prince can actually turn back into a frog. They're convinced that Alan Jackson was telling the truth when he sang about living on love. But Paul brings them back to earth and says, no, singleness might be preferred Because marriage is hard. Singleness might be preferred because there is trouble associated to marriage that a single just doesn't have to deal with. A single can go eat wherever they want to eat. Why? Because there's only one of them. A single doesn't have to decide whose year is it for Christmas. They don't have to worry about that. Why? Because they're single. Paul says there's a lot of worldly trouble that just comes along with there being two becoming one. So singleness might be preferred because marriage is hard. Number 3, singleness might be preferred because the world is passing away. This is so interesting to me. I want us to read all 3 of these verses. We don't normally do that, but I want to read all 3, and then we'll go back and tear it apart. And the reason is because Paul gets to the point at the end of the sentence. So here's what he says, verse 29. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. Why? Why would we live that way? For the present form of this world is passing away. Present form means the fashion, the manner of life, the mode. Paul is saying you got to understand the mode of this world, the way that the world operates now, that mode is temporary. It's dying. It is passing away. The way the world works now is not permanent. The way the world is now is not how eternity will be. So don't waste a ton of time and energy and effort on something that is temporary. If you knew that they were building a house for you that was going to be where you lived forever, and you were just going to live in the house you were in for a year, would you spend a ton of time decorating and fixing up the house you were going to live there for a year? No. Why? Because you knew that the permanent place was coming. That's Paul's point. The world as we know it, the form in which we currently live is dying. It's temporary. It's passing away. So don't live according to the systems of the world. Live for your final destination. Look what he says in verse 29. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time, our life, our appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Let me first tell you what Paul is not saying. Paul is not abolishing Christian marriage. As some people try to say that's what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. Paul is not saying that you shouldn't live out the responsibilities that you promised to one another on the day of marriage, because we just spent the beginning of chapter 7 talking about conjugal rights and all of those things that Paul taught. So he's not saying that we don't do for one another what marriage requires. What's he saying? Paul is saying that your marriage responsibilities are not an excuse for slacking on your responsibilities to the Lord. He's saying you and I cannot say, I don't have time to serve the Lord. I don't have time to do what He's called me to do. I don't have time to disciple my friends and my neighbors and my loved ones. I don't have time to do all that because I'm married and it just takes so much out of me. Paul says, no, if you're married, you got to live as one who's married, but toward the Lord, you have to live as one who is not married. Your marriage responsibilities are not an opportunity for slacking on spiritual service. Why? Because marriage is for this life that is passing away. Marriage is not for the next life. Look what he says at the end of verse 30. And those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. Paul momentarily shifts. He's again teaching us another principle. What's the principle? The principle is live for there, not for here. Lay up treasure in heaven, not on earth. And he told us in our marriage, lay up treasure in heaven. But now he moves to our emotions. Lay up treasure in heaven with your emotions. He wants those who mourn to operate as though they were not mourning. And he wants those who are rejoicing to live, to operate as though they were not rejoicing. Please understand this. And I know this isn't popular, but I really need you to understand this. As a believer, your emotions are more controllable than you think. As a Christian, your emotions are more controllable than you think. Christians are not supposed to be emotionless robots. Christians should never be heartless, or they should never be indifferent. However, Christians should never be controlled by their emotions. Why? Because here he tells us those who mourn should control that and act as though they're not mourning. And those who rejoice should control that and act as though they're not rejoicing. As a believer, when we have the opportunity to mourn because we lost someone very precious to us, we should mourn, but not fall apart. As a believer, when we have the opportunity to rejoice because something wonderful has happened to us, we should rejoice. But we shouldn't have our heads so far in the clouds that we lose sight of what really matters. Paul talked about marriage. He talked about emotions. Now he's going to move that same principle and talk to us about possessions. Look at the end of verse 30. And those who buy as though they had no goods. Many Christians have a preoccupation with bank accounts and houses and vacations and cars and toys. And Paul says the form of this world is passing away. And so those who buy should behave as though they have nothing. There's one last area that Paul deals with, and that's pleasure. Verse 31. And those who deal with the world, that's as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. Those who deal with the world, that's Paul's way of saying pleasure. Those who live in the world, who deal in the world, they have all the creature comforts. They have all of the new stuff. They deal in the world. You see, our preoccupation with creature comforts and leisure and early retirement and all the things, they can show a desire of us to hang on to the world that is passing away. I've met some people who couldn't wait to retire because they just wanted to live on a beach somewhere. And I've seen other people who couldn't wait to retire because it gave them the opportunity to pour into their church and to pour into their community and to disciple others and to spend their life doing what they really cared about and what really gave them eternal purpose. Paul says we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful because singleness might be preferred because this world is passing away. Number 4, singleness might be preferred because of marriage responsibilities. Singleness might be preferred because of marriage responsibilities. Look at verse 32. Paul says, I want you to be free from anxieties. And the unmarried man is anxious about what? The things of the Lord. How to please the Lord. Verse 33, but the married man is anxious about worldly things. How to please his wife. Verse 34, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. You see what Paul's saying? Singleness might be preferred just because of marriage responsibilities. Paul says that a man without a wife is free to devote himself to the Lord, and a man with a wife must concern himself with worldly things like houses and quality time and health insurance and everything else. A woman without a husband is free to devote herself to the Lord. But a woman with a husband has to concern herself with worldly things like maybe house chores or helper incomes or laundry and everything else. I literally said the word laundry and I watched all you women just melt like, oh, I hate that. See, Paul's point is popular. It's not popular, but it's actually very clear. The moment that we take a spouse, the time that we can dedicate to the Lord takes a substantial hit. Paul's not saying marriage is sinful. He's already said marriage is good. But you got to understand, marriage does limit our devotion to the Lord in a way that nothing else can. But again, remember, Paul said singleness is only good if you can restrict your sexual passions. It is better to marry. It is better to lower your limits and your availability for the Lord than it is to disqualify yourself by living in sexual immorality. So Paul's question is, can you control your sexual passions? No. Then get married. Can you control your sexual passions? Yes. Then you need to really think about staying single. Why? Because of the time that you would be able to dedicate to the Lord. Verse 35, I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but catch this, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Paul wants us to know that this knowledge that the world is passing away, it's for our benefit. And Paul's goal is to promote good order for our lives. When we are so wrapped up in our marriage that we have no time for the Lord, we are not in good order. When we are so wrapped up in our emotions that we have no energy for the Lord, then we are not in good order. When we are so wrapped up in our possessions that we have no interest in the Lord, then we are not in good order. And we are so wrapped up in pleasure and in leisure that serving the Lord is too uncomfortable or too hard. We are not in good order. So what is good order? To secure our undivided devotion to the Lord. Did you know that was God's expectation for you? Did you know that God didn't just save you because He liked you so much? He just wanted you around heaven because heaven just wouldn't be the same without you. Did you know that's not what it is? Did you know that He gave you the opportunity to make Him the Lord of your life so that you could have undivided, unparalleled, no compete clause for your devotion to Him? That's what He wants. He wants our undivided devotion. And some of us can't give Him our devotion without a wife, but some can. And Paul said singleness might be preferred because of married responsibilities. The fifth thing he says is this: singleness might be preferred because of a father's promise. This reason is extremely cultural, so we're not going to spend a ton of time because it doesn't really apply to us a ton, but it's in your Bible, so you should know what it says. When Paul authored 1 Corinthians, the most common form of marriage was arranged marriages. And apparently, Some of the Corinthian daddies had promised that they were never going to arrange a marriage for their daughters. I can get on board with that. They were convinced by somebody in the church that singleness was more spiritual, and so they had made a vow, they'd made a promise that I'm never going to arrange a marriage for my son or my daughter because I want them to have the best, which is singleness. Paul's already kind of blown that argument up, so look at verse 36. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his daughter, his son, his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. Paul says, if anyone thinks that a dad thinks he's not behaving properly toward his son, because when his son was a little boy, the dad said, I'm going to make him be single because I just don't see the benefits. I think it'd be good for him to stay single. And then the boy becomes a teenager and the dad goes, uh-oh, he needs a wife. The dad was in a quandary going, what do I do? Because I said I wasn't, and I made the promise that I wasn't going to let him get married, but now I can see that he really needs one. Paul says, let them marry. It's not a sin to change your mind. Arrange a marriage for your son, arrange a marriage for your daughter when you become aware of their need for it. Verse 37, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control. You see, this son can control his desire and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed. He will do well. Paul says, if a father is convinced that singleness is what is best for his son or his daughter, then let him be single. Don't arrange the marriage. You'll do well. Verse 38, so then he who marries his betrothed does well. If a dad sends his daughter out to be married, good. And he who refrains from marriage will do even better. This is a really important concept, and we don't have time to really unpack it. We'll revisit it at some other time. But I just want you to kind of get this in your mind. Most Christians live their life concerned about whether something is good or bad. Is it a sin? Is it not a sin? Can I do it? Can I not do it? In the last 2 chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul has completely switched that question. It's not, can I? Paul has shifted it to, should I? See, Paul is not answering the question of is it good or is it bad? Paul is answering the question, is it good or is it best? So he says, is it good that they marry? Yes. But it might be best that they don't. Number 6, Paul says that singleness might be preferred because marriage is permanent. Singleness might be preferred because marriage is permanent. Look at verse 39. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Paul reminds us again that a wife is bound to a husband until one of them dies, and a husband is bound to a wife for the same amount of time. One reason, Paul says, to stay single if you can is because marriage is a really, really, really long time. And if you attach your cart to the wrong horse, you might have a miserable existence until one of you dies. Amanda and I got married, and I looked her in the eye and I said, this will kill one of us. You see, he says that a Christian, if your spouse dies, you can remarry. That's fine. That's okay. But only in the Lord. Paul adds this little phrase just to remind the Corinthians that a person, a Christian, is really only free to marry someone that the Lord approves of. Christians are never permitted to marry unbelievers. We don't do missionary dating. So whether you are married for the first time or remarrying after a biblical divorce or remarrying after the loss of a spouse, you must always marry in the Lord. Obey God's expectation of marrying someone who is a help to you spiritually. Verse 40, yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Paul is not letting go of the idea that singleness in a lot of cases is better if the individual can remain pure. Now, I love this last little part of this verse. I think I've often told you guys of my desire to write a book on smart alecks in the Bible because there's some really good ones. And this one's slowly creeping up the list. Apparently, there were troublemakers in the church at Corinth who was telling everybody they knew what they ought to do. You ought to stay single. How do I know? Because I have the Spirit of God. You need to get married. How do I know? Because I have the Spirit of God. Paul has just spent 40 verses in one chapter laying out all the various scenarios of what people ought to do, and then he smart aleckly writes at the end, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So don't let all the other people tell you they know what to do. I have the revelation of God. And here's what he says to the celibate. Here's what he says to the divorced. Here's what he says to the widowed. Here's what he says to a Christian married to a Christian. Here's what he says to a Christian married to a non-Christian who wants to stay married. Here's what he says to a Christian married to a non-Christian who wants to go. And here's what he says to the singles, to the never married. And I have the Spirit of God too. For the past 4 weeks, we've covered the entire landscape of physical, sexual relationships. So what is our takeaway? Let me quickly give you 3 things. Number 1, you need to know that God cares deeply about your relationship status. Do not subdivide your life into things that are churchy and things that aren't. If Jesus is the Lord and Master and ruler of your life, He is the Lord of everything, or He is the Lord of nothing. And you must learn that God cares deeply about your relationship status. He wrote in plain words that we may know what He wants us to do. Why? Because He cares deeply. We can honor Him with our relationship status. Number 2, you ought to know your scenario and obey accordingly. You ought to know your scenario. And if God says you have an option, take your option. But if you're in a scenario where God says there is no option, then you live in submission and in obedience to Him. Know your scenario and obey accordingly. Now I can hear some of you thinking, Tim, my married status has been set and fixed since before you was even born. That's fair. I get that. But I think there's something really important for us on this 3rd thing to remember. Number 3, know the wisdom of God so you can help others. You may be married. You may be divorced. You may be widowed. You may be in one of these scenarios and your situation may be fixed, or you may be fixed in your situation, whatever it may be. But there are children, there are grandchildren, there are neighbors, there are friends, there are young people, there are people that you know, people that you have influence over, that you can now remember and know God's law, God's rules, God's expectation for human relationships. And now you can guide them where maybe you failed, or you can guide them in your successes. Doesn't matter. But now you know the information, and it's not just for you. Listen, do you know what makes the Dead Sea dead? everything flows into it and nothing ever flows out of it. Everything goes to the Dead Sea to die. Why? Because everything comes in and nothing goes out. And you will die spiritually if you become the Dead Sea. If all you ever do is take in information for you and you're just storing it up for Bible Jeopardy whenever that moment comes, you will die spiritually. Why? Because your life is found in sharing it with others. You say, none of this applies to me. Good. It applies to somebody you know. So love them and get close to them and share it with them. One of the greatest things we did in Buffalo, I've always had this policy. When I marry somebody, I do 6 months of premarital counseling. We talk about everything because you need to know what you're getting into before you get married. One of the hardest times for Amanda and I was a month after we got married because we didn't have really good premarital counseling. And we sat there a month in. She thought it and I thought it. We didn't say it to each other, but it's like, what have we done? Because we were two billy goats. And I look back and I'm going, man, what I would have given for somebody to invest in me in that moment. And to say to me, Tim, here's how a husband ought to act in the Lord. Don't fight to win, lead to solve. And what Amanda would have given for a godly wife to come alongside of her and say, here's how we do this. And as an older woman, I'm going to teach you as a younger woman how to love the Lord and your husband. When we were in Buffalo, when I married a couple, I would do 6 months of premarital counseling, and then they would get married, and I would assign them a couple in the church. And that older, established couple knew their job. Their job was once a month, take that young couple out, buy them dinner because they're broke, and talk to them, and just mentor them and help them. Why? Because you are not the Dead Sea. God doesn't give you information just for it to go to you and die. He gives you information. Maybe he gives you his word so your granddaughter will hear it. Maybe he gives you his word so your son will hear it. Maybe he gives you his word that somebody else should have given to you but didn't. So that you can make a difference in somebody else's human relationship. Because the Lord has told us what He expects of us all.